Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're having a great day so far, and welcome to today's video where we're going to be talking about these bad boys, these Hourglass holiday palettes, these ambient lighting edit palettes that I have been obsessed with for many years. As you can tell, let me put them down, my fingers are going to snap off. Some are many years old, some are brand new. We want to know which is my favorite, which is the best ever. Are they worth the money? Are they worth picking up? So without further ado, let's get started. So I have been working on this ranking inadvertently with no real intention of like sharing a ranking video with you guys. And then it just popped into my head. I should share my thoughts with you because I think it'll be helpful. There are some of these still available. Sometimes they come back on Hourglass's website. I'm sure there'll be more next year. And you want to know which is the best of the best. What should we look out for? What should we avoid? How do I feel about them? The ones that I've had for many years, do I still use them? Do they stack up against the most recent ones? I think all of this is helpful information to share with you guys. And I have just been going back and forth, especially between last year's palettes and this year's palettes, trying to determine which is the greatest of all time, the GOAT, if you will. And today we're going to find out, at least in my opinion. So I own 7 of the palettes. I have the Unlocked and Sculpture. I think Unlocked was my first and then Sculpture was my second. I then skipped a year and then last year I picked up Elephant and Tiger. And then this year I ended up with all 3. I initially picked up Snake and Jellyfish for my review, and then when Leopard was massively reduced, I went back and grabbed that one as well. So that is my collection. Let's start off with 7th place, and it is Elephant. Here she is in all her glory. And to be clear, I love every one of these palettes. Elephant coming in 7th place doesn't mean I think it's rubbish. I think it's useless. I don't like it. It's just my least favorite. And the few reasons for that are, overall, it's quite pinky leaning with the blushes, which you guys know is not really my vibe. I'm not really a pink girl when it comes to blush. One of them does lean a little corally, which helps me, and I do really like that one. That's this blush here. And the highlight is also quite metallic in here, so again, it's just not typically my preference. It also, when it comes to these palettes, it has 2 of the ambient lighting powders, and I would rather there were none, frankly, personally. So the fact that, you know, 1/3 of the palette is a product I don't really use means that I can't love it any more than I do, because I wish there was a maximum of 1, if not none, in there. But you know, she is a super beautiful palette, and I think if you have a light medium to medium skin tone and you like pink a little bit more than I do, this could be your favorite. You know, Hourglass bronzers also typically run warm, and this, it might be the warmest of all. It's straight up orange. So she's in 7th place. In 6th place, we have Sculpture, a pretty oldie but a goodie. Again, we've got 2 of those darned ambient lighting powders, dim light and diffused light, which I wish we only had 1. And there's just really not anything proper wow factor in here for me. Everything is nice. Everything is solid. We've got some really nice blushes, and we've got quite a nice variance as well. You know, we've got a real like orangey coral and then a real mauvey sort of plummy blush. So quite nice differentiation between the blushes in here. The bronzer isn't quite as orange either, which I appreciate. It's a little more of a neutral bronzer. All of the formulas are fantastic. It does have one of my favorite highlighters, much more of a subtle, smoother highlighter, which is my preference. Everything is super wearable. It does feature Mood Exposure blush, and it is a lighter. I don't know if I just got, I think the thing is the pan is just, I got a lot of the lighter swirl in this specific pan. So the Mood Exposure that is in here is not as good or as intense as some of the other Mood Exposures that I have in other palettes and the single that I have, but a very wearable everyday palette. I think looking at it, other than the sort of brand new ones that I have from this year, this is the least used. I couldn't really tell you why, because I think everything is very wearable and usable in there. It's just maybe it's quite understated. I think there's nothing wow. You know, the shades of blush are quite muted and understated and subtle. very pretty though, and the same thing goes for the highlighter, which I really like. The bronzer is softer. It's probably the most natural of all, but probably like the least wow factor effect overall on the cheeks, is why it sort of maybe gets a little forgotten about, but a beautiful palette. In 5th place, we have our first palette from this year, and it is Jellyfish. Probably my favorite packaging though. Glorious. The biggest letdown in this palette is those 2 very light finishing powders. This was the lightest of the 3 palettes this year, and that's why I do really like it, don't get me wrong, but that's why it's probably my least favorite, and why it has those 2 very light finishing powders. I think I've only had one of these, and it was that one, because this one I just I'm never going to be able to use that. It's always going to be too light for me. But to be fair to the palette, it is the one that's designed for fairer skin, so that really counts against the palette, just because there are 2 shades in there. I can only use one of them in the starkest of winter, and the other one I can't ever use. It's just too light for me. I tried once and I looked utterly bonkers. It's again quite muted, understated, but so pretty, and the blush colours are really nice sort of rosy tones, which I really love. I think it's super beautiful. Again, the bronzer is not too orangey of an undertone, a very pretty wearable palette. There are a couple of reasons why it's slightly lower than some of the others. One, this highlighter is really quite icy and takes a bit of work to blend into my skin tone because it is just a little too light for me, and then I can't use either of the finishing powders really, so therefore that just bumps it down a little bit. But the other products in there, bronzer and blushes, I really love. In 4th place, and definitely the most used, although it is also I think the oldest, is Unlocked, the one that started it all for me. And you see how flat some of those are. This has got a lot of use over the years, and she's still going strong. What is this, 5 years old? Probably more. I dread to think how old she is, but I would still use this now. I don't care. Use by dates don't scare me, not when it comes to makeup anyway, and actually, if I'm being honest, not when it comes to food a lot of the time either. Now this does have 2 finishing powders, which I wish it didn't, but they are both perfect for my skin tone. So it has soft light and filtered light, and I think they are my favorite ever finishing powders. They're just absolutely perfect. I think they were like limited edition for this palette. I don't remember seeing either of those in other palettes, but they are literally spot on perfect for my skin tone. And these blushes are absolutely perfect. I just love them. They are right up my street. We've got a really beautiful lighter, softer, peachy shade that is really hard to find from Hourglass. You really can't find it. And then the bronzer is a really nice, very glowy, more subtle bronzer on my skin tone. Such just like my type of shades overall, and finishes as well, so glowy. And it's just a super pretty, quite natural again effect on the skin, but so much glow. And I go wild for this blush. It's my absolute fave. Could even be my favourite blush to ever appear in any of these ambient lighting palettes. I think it's been such a long time since we saw a glorious glowy peach like that in these types of palettes. Please give me another one. Give me that one back in one of the new ones. I would love it. But it's definitely been, up until now, the one that has got the most juice. You know, most of these powders are almost completely flat now, and I really love it. Everything works for me on my skin tone, but I do wish it only had one finishing powder. So these top 3 are the 3 that was really hard and has taken me weeks and weeks going back and forth about which one do I like the most. These are my 3 favourites. Leopard, Snake and Tiger. I absolutely love all 3 of these for different reasons. In 3rd place though, it is Snake. Absolutely glorious. It's so vibrant and beautiful to look at, absolutely gorgeous. We only have one finishing powder, which really counts in its favour, and we have 3 blushes, as well as a more sort of my type of highlighter, a little bit more subtle and smoother than in some of the palettes, and the bronzer as well is a little more neutral and flattering. This was the deepest of the palettes from this year. So as you can see, it is a lot richer than the others that we've looked at so far, because this was this year's deeper skin toned palette. So in summer, this is absolutely stunning. Such beautiful shades. I love that we've got like a difference of finish when it comes to blush. We've got some more satin blushes, and then we've got a super metallic blush, and then this gorgeous understated highlighter and bronzer as well that's not too shimmery or glittery. The reason this one can't be any higher than it is that I just can't really use this very easily unless we're in summer. I really love this one, and it could have been my favourite, absolutely. And in summer, this order would undoubtedly be different. But when I'm thinking about year round, which ones can I use in summer and in winter and get the most out of and suits my skin tone, whether I'm on holiday or whether it's January the 1st, this one is bumped down a little because the highlighter does. I can absolutely use the highlighter, but in winter I will need to like buff it in and work it into the skin so it doesn't leave colour or leave a visible cast on my skin. And then also the finishing powder, which is Radiant Light, becomes a little too deep for me. So in winter I can't use everything in here without being strategic and careful, so that's why it goes into third. But a beautiful palette, and like I said, in summer we might have to jiggle the order around. And in second place, bumped off of first spot this year, it's Tiger. So this was last year's richest, deepest palette, and oh, she's absolutely glorious and has something that massively goes in its favour, and that's the complete lack for my skin tone of a finishing powder, because the finishing powder in here is for much deeper skin tone than mine. So for me it's a bronzer. This is the palette I used today, and oh, I absolutely love it. I love the balance in here because we haven't got something that for me is a finishing powder. There's nothing in here I don't use. I've got a bronzer, I've then got 3 blushes to choose from and 2 highlighters to choose from, and that's just how I wish it was every year. That is like, forget the finishing powders. Most of us don't want them, or we already have them. Just give us 3 blushes, 2 highlighters and a bronzer, and we're living the dream. It's absolutely gorgeous. So many options, so much versatility in there and choice when it comes to the finishes and when it comes to the shades. This has absolutely been my favourite palette for a long time, but much like Snake, I used this today, but it was tricky. I applied the highlighter and it very much left a cast and a visible colour where I placed it, which I then had to buff away and use a bit of setting powder to sort of buff into the cheeks. I then also used, what blush did I use? I used the metallic in the middle here. This blush, absolutely glorious, and in summer, stunning. But in winter, again, I needed to use a very light hand, and then I also needed to really buff it into the skin for it to work on my skin tone. Again, in summer, this would be my absolute fave of the bunch, but in winter I don't like it as much. It's trickier for me to use. I have to be a bit careful with it, so it can't be my absolute favorite, but oh, she's good. And it's definitely my favorite layout and inclusion of which powders, because like I said, I really don't use the finishing powders, and therefore the lack of one in there for me and how I use it is perfect. Like, take them out. So you all know that in first place is Leopard, my newest purchase. I've been going back and forth between all of these palettes and finally settled on this one being my favourite. This was the medium palette this year, and therefore, as you can see, everything in there is more suited than the lighter or deeper palettes to my skin tone. I can use everything in here all year round. You know, in summer this won't be too light for me, like Jellyfish, you know, is too light for me in winter, some of the powders in there, but in summer will definitely be too light for me. Lots of the powders in there, lots of the products in there, whereas Snake and Tiger, too deep for me in winter. This one is going to be usable, wearable and beautiful on my skin tone all year round. It also only has 1 finishing powder, which, like I said, really counts in its favour. I think the highlighter, while being quite impactful and metallic, can really be buffed into the skin beautifully, and it becomes really smooth and pretty. The blushes are just absolutely beautiful, right up my street, and the finishes are absolutely stunning. That was also something I forgot to mention when I was trying to choose between Snake and Tiger. The finishes of Snake, the blushes, and I think the bronzer are mattes, whereas the Tiger palette overall is much glowier. So that's why Tiger edges it over Snake. Sorry to digress, but I forgot to mention that. Some very, very subtle blushes in here, but these build beautifully on the cheeks to just give a very natural, pretty effect. And then you've got a much more vibrant one. The highlighter is, like I said, quite metallic for my taste, but does blend really beautifully into the skin to be more seamless. And then the bronzer is just the perfect sweet spot for me. Yes, it is warm, but it's not too orange and it's not too cool. And it's got a beautiful, perfect amount of softer, buildable pigmentation. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, but Charlotte, it's got the same bronzer in it as the Elephant palette, which you said you didn't like, but does it though? And I will say it does have the same name. So the bronzer in Elephant is the Lustrous Bronze Light. And the same bronzer, Lustrous Bronze Light, is also in Leopard. But when you swatch them next to each other, Elephant is noticeably warmer and more orange. I hope that's coming across in camera, because in person, they definitely are not exactly the same shade. The bronzer in Elephant is also more metallic, and the bronzer formula in Leopard is definitely smoother and more luminous, as opposed to being almost like a highlighter finish. So they aren't exactly the same, I promise, even though they have the same name. Which is interesting, because I know we often get furious that we have repeats in these palettes and, oh, you know, we've got that bronzer or that blush or that highlight that was in last year's palettes. But are they in fact exactly the same? Not always. You know, another example of this is Mood Exposure, which is in the Sculpture palette. And this was the one that I said earlier is a sort of lighter version of Mood Exposure, barely visible on my hand there. And we have Mood Exposure also in the Leopard palette. And while they are very close, very similar, can you see that the Leopard one just has a bit more pigmentation? It's just a little bit more visible on my skin tone. So when building up, I can get like a blush effect out of that pan, but not so much in the Sculpture pan. But I think a lot of that is just how much swirl of each of the two shades you get, which is an annoying sort of unfortunate occurrence from those swirled ambient lighting powders, because every pan is a little different depending on how your swirl is, how much of each of the shades you get. So I do think that is the same colour. I've just got a bit more of the richer swirl in the Leopard palette, which is lucky for me. I just think the Leopard is the perfect palette for my skin tone. It's only got one of the ambient lighting powders, and it is a good one for my skin tone. I've got blushes that have a sheen and ones that are more satin. I've got the perfect highlighter, the perfect bronzer. It's just the one that works for me the best for my skin tone and my preferences all year round, as opposed to the others. So a new number one. I love her so much. And the bonus is, I have to tell you again, I got this for £30. So I'm not going to lie to you, how chuffed I was about getting it for such a great price point must make me love it even more, I'm sure of it. So there you have it. Those are my Hourglass Ambient Lighting Holiday palettes ranked for you. Please tell me which is your favorite. I completely skipped the melted chocolate year when they had those palettes. I wasn't really a big fan of those, and I was taking a break from Hourglass. Are there any that I don't have that you think I would love? What is your absolute favorite? Did you buy these this year? Do you just not like these at all and not get the hype? Let us know all of your thoughts in the comment section down below. But I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, and I would love to see you in the next one. Otherwise, take care for now. Bye 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 bye.